you. Okay, so I'm delighted to be able to share some of my research with you. So this research was done over last summer, and it was with my colleague Ian Blackwell, who might be on the call. I think hopefully he's going to be joining us, but I'm delighted to share this with you. This is quite a sort of new area for me. My research to date has been looking at sort of dads in the workplace, so looking at dads who face challenges in the workplace when they wanted to actively be involved in caregiving, and so when particularly looking at when they were sort of working sort of part-time or more flexibly, some of the challenges that they've faced. I'm an academic based in the business school, so that's very much my sort of background. So it was really interesting for me to sort of look at sort of the experiences of dads in prisons. It kind of came about because my sister was working in a prison at the time, and so I was sort of talking about some of the challenges that dads in the workplace face. I've called this fatherhood forfeits, and I've sort of highlighted that dads face a numerous number of forfeits when they try and be actively involved in caregiving, and I was explaining about their plight to my sister, and then she was sort of highlighting actually in the prison. She said, I'm not sure how much we do in the prison for dads and how much we actually focus on dads and fatherhood as a thing. And so she was sort of saying, actually, I think that might be really interesting to explore. So that's kind of what got us into this. I then sort of applied for some funding to be able to support the research, and I was delighted to have support from the Leverhulme Foundation, who supported this funding. So I really sort of thank you for that. So what we kind of did right at the start, as you would expect any sort of academic to do, is to kind of look a little bit about what's been done before and what's been said in this space before. And one thing that I noticed pretty quickly is that there was quite a dearth of information about incarcerated fathers compared to that of mothers. It does exist, and there's some great stuff that exists, but nowhere near as much about the experiences of dads as there is about mothers. So that kind of made me feel quite sort of happy that this was something worth investing my time into, worth doing. And also particularly that came out of that sort of early literature review was how important it is when it comes to reoffending. And I'm sure all of you on this call will know how important the family ties are and maintaining family ties and the significant links towards reduced reoffending. So again, it had a really sort of clear purpose and made me really want to find out a little bit more about the experience of dads in prison and what we can do to support them, in numerous sort of ways. And we'll go through some of those options towards the end. As I kind of mentioned, I've sort of located in a business school, so my experience has been from business schools. I'm particularly looking at workplace experience of dads. So I've made some recommendations at the end that I would really appreciate some discussion with you all about, because I don't come at a sort of criminology angle, which a lot of you will, and it'd be really interesting to hear what you think about the recommendations and then what you think some of the sort of practicalities around that might be. So our sample, what we asked for was we asked for the dads to be biological or to be stepfathers of children under 18, and for them to be recently released from prison. So within the last sort of 12 months, that their experience was relatively new and relatively sort of fresh, so they could recount their experience. And what we also asked for them to have been actively involved in caregiving before they went into prison. So particularly that they were the dads who were sort of at the school run, they were taking part in children's activities, they had an active involvement. They weren't kind of working away and weren't really around anyway. They were particularly for dads who had quite an active involvement. The original sort of plan for the study was that we would interview dads in prison and then we would interview them afterwards. And we had quite a lot of complications around getting the ethics, which meant that we weren't able to do that. So we actually interviewed them in the community in the end and asked them to look retrospectively. Actually, I think that worked really well. I was really kind of pleased that happened in the end, because they were able to give us a really good insight across a period of time about how things worked, and particularly talk about how they hoped things would go and how they actually went and what they might want to do a little bit different. And lots of them gave lots of sort of ideas and tips about how we can improve things for this population, and that's some of the things that feed into the recommendations that we've made. So we recruited via social media and via organisations, and I think some of them will probably be on the call that helped us, particularly through sort of printing out some of the calls with participants, putting them up in waiting rooms and sharing them with the dads that they were familiar with. It took quite a long time for us to get our sample together. It was quite a hard to reach population for us, and we didn't really have much luck. We did find once we did put an incentive in there, we had a lot more luck, and we had to kind of close at 30, but we had a lot more dads who come forward who wanted to be interviewed. So it was quite difficult for any sort of academic to get people to respond to interview requests. So we were delighted when loads came forward, and it was quite sad for us to not be able to interview everybody and hear their story. But unfortunately, we were on a timeline and needs must, so we sort of stopped at 30. And certainly we noticed with the data that we started to reach saturation at around sort of 21, 22, in which a lot of the dads we spoke to were saying the same things. So we did feel quite happy that the dads that we spoke to have given us a really good indication of their experiences. We asked them what their roles were before they went into prison, and you can see there's quite a sort of wide range of occupations. So again, gives us a good idea, a real sort of subset of the population, ranging from teachers to chefs, plumbers, engineers. So we had a full range of dads that came forward. We interviewed them online through Teams or through Zoom in a sort of semi-structured way to enable us to really sort of delve deep into certain things, but we did ask them all essentially the same questions. So what I've sort of done is divided up the data into sort of three main areas, particularly looking at what happened before they went into prison, their experience whilst they were in prison, and then reflecting what it was like since they've come out of prison. And one thing that was really quite typical within the sample was talking about how involved they were pre-prison, which kind of reassured us that we'd got the right people, because we really wanted to have dads who were actively involved in caregiving. And that was very much what came out through the narratives, with that our sample were actively involved. They were sort of taking the primary caregiving roles in the main, and or at least dual caregiving. So actively involved in the activities such as bedtimes. If the children were sick, they'd be called, taking them to school runs, taking them to activities, as I mentioned before. There was two kind of main things that really came out of that part of the interview, particularly discussing financial challenges, with many of the dads talking about the desire to provide for their family and the challenges in provision for their family, but also actually implying that they went into crime because they wanted to have more money for their family, and they were struggling financially, which is really quite interesting. And that did come up quite a lot, that many dads sort of talking about the real difficulty they were finding themselves wanting to be actively involved, but still trying to norm to this idea that they should be a breadwinner as well, and feeling that's quite challenging, which does kind of echo to my previous work with sort of broader samples as well. The next thing that came up, and again this echoed with my previous work, was this difficulty of the dads obtaining flexibility. And that's what my previous work has found, that dads find it more difficult to have flexibility and therefore combine work and care. And the sort of upshot of that for many families is the mother will automatically become the primary caregiver because they can have more flexibility. I've summarised a lot of research in about 30 seconds there, but just to kind of give you an indication, it was quite interesting for this population, as with sort of broader populations, there were significant challenges with flexibility. Some implied, again, that's kind of why they went down the route they did for the flexibility, but it was much more of an implication rather than a significant theme. So I don't want to kind of talk about that too much, but certainly there was a real feeling with our sample that these were dads who were actively involved, who loved their family and very keen to remain actively involved despite the separation that was enforced by the incarceration. So we then went on to discuss their in-prison experience, and particularly talked about how they managed that and how they kept in contact with their children. And that was one of the main sort of things that came up really strongly, was how they kept in contact through phone calls. And that was a key sort of lifeline for them through having then been able to actually sort of do fathering and undertake fathering in quite a distant way. So that came up as quite as a primary tool for most of our sample, to be honest, particularly looking at sort of phone calls. And the sort of Asif here talks about it wasn't the same, of course, being in person, but it did enable them to be able to keep in contact with their children and keep that relationship going. And that during those calls, they did lots of things such as advising on homework, giving teenagers their advice, and generally being present, even though they weren't physically present. What kind of struck me from the data when we talked about this element with dads is how challenging that was, how challenging those calls were in many ways. And there's been things that have actually come out since about this that I wanted to mention as well. The costs came out a lot. Many dads talking about the sort of cost to have credit, and they didn't always have enough credit to be able to for their children. Some of the dads who's had a more successful situation, shall we say, and felt that they actually their children hadn't been as impacted, were the dads who said they were able to have a lot of of phone credit. And in the main, that came from money being sent in by their partner or their family, which kind of implies an element of sort of means testing almost, and a kind of tiered society in which the dads who were in prison, who had access to money, were able to have a lot more calls than those dads who weren't. One dad in particular talked about how he reckoned he spent nearly £2,000 on phone calls, but as a consequence, he was in regular contact with his children numerous times a day, was able to contact their children. And particularly one dad, I think it's on the next slide, but he talked about how he was able to have breakfast with his children on FaceTime. He was able to do their homework with them in the night. He was actively involved. So when he came out from prison, he actually felt it was quite an easy transition because he'd been there the whole time, although albeit not being actually physically there, he'd been there on FaceTime. Many of the dads talked about some of the difficulties around phone credit, in that they would have to sort of choose between sort of having some more sort of hygiene factors such as decent toothpaste and shower gel and deodorant, or the phone credit, and saying that actually that's quite difficult and difficult choice to make. The logistics came up a lot as well with the sample, with dads kind of talking about the sort of, if they didn't have in-cell phones, needing to have phone calls on the landing and then being overheard, and then needing to queue, and sometimes not, that resulted them not being able to speak to their child. And a quote that I've kind of given there from Brian talks about how sometimes he'd say, I'll call them tomorrow, and my children will be looking forward to that call, but actually what would happen is you wouldn't make it in time because someone will be longer on their call and you wouldn't be able to speak to the child at that time. And after that time, they might have gone to bed, or they might have gone to school, or whatever that might be, and then the opportunity had been missed. And his concern was then my child feels like I've disappeared and I've let them down throughout, but even though it wasn't necessarily their fault, they might have been in the queue at the allocated time but didn't quite get there. And that really kind of that really stuck with me, because you can see the frustration in the narratives when the dads were they were ready, they were looking forward to their call, their child's waiting by the phone, knowing their child's waiting by the phone, and actually that call never comes. So you can see when you kind of go later on, and I'll go through some of the data about how some of the children felt and how sort of the anger that they felt, you can see how that can be caused. And that isn't necessarily the dad's fault. That they've done everything they can do to make sure they have that call on time. They also mentioned the time of the calls, saying that sometimes they would be standard to have 20-minute calls, whereas sometimes they would be 3-minute calls. And that was particularly complex for the dads who had slightly older children. Anyone who's got teenagers on this call, I've got teenagers on this call, I need to have a decent amount of time if I'm ever going to get anything from them. In a 3-minute call, I'd be lucky to say hello, you're right, yes, that would be the end of the conversation. It takes a long time to build up a conversation with a teenager. And that was something that a lot of the dads were sort of talking about, how the 3-minute call was it was just upsetting for everybody. You just just about to say hello, you can't get into anything, and then that needs to be cut short, which meant it stopped being so meaningful and stopped sort of being so helpful to the children themselves, but also to the dads. One thing that's kind of come up sort of since in conversations, which it would be great to explore a little bit later, was about the sort of the value of video calls, but also how that can be actually quite challenging for people. That can be quite challenging sometimes to actually know what to say on those calls and to how to manage those calls, particularly if you've got someone who's quite non-responsive on the other end. And it was mentioned to me in a separate conversation about how there's scope for us to do a lot more to support dads in actually what to talk about in those conversations and how to sort of facilitate those conversations. And it'd be good to get some input on that later on. And the next thing that came up was the discussion around visits and the sort of value of visits, and actually some of the trade-offs that some of the dads were talking about with regards to visits. Because some dads felt that the visits were really positive, that they were able to play with their children and really engage with their children, and it was a key sort of tool for them to be able to keep that relationship going. Whereas that wasn't the experience universally. Some of the dads talked about the challenges with the visits, and actually said as a result they asked their children not to visit because they felt it was too difficult for them, particularly around sort of the dads some dads talked about their children seeing them in handcuffs, and at the end of the visit being taken away in handcuffs, and how hard that was for them. They talked about detailed searches, and again how challenging that was for them. So there was this real sort of difficulty with the dad sort of making this hard choice about whether actually do we want our children to come in and see me? Is it worth it for us, knowing that they might find it really quite traumatic? And actually, some dads are saying, I just decided to not So not have to have them visit. I felt that that was the best way forward. However, once they came out of prison, the relationship had broken down in many ways. And one dad reflected, actually, I wish I'd said yes to the visits and found a way of making them work. Because as a result, the child felt that they'd been left when that wasn't the intention. They were trying to reduce the trauma. So you can really see the challenge and the difficult decision that the dads had to make. One thing that came up, and it was mentioned right at the start, is this invisibility of the fatherhood status, and that came up in a lot of the narrative. The dads were really positive about the amount of support they had with regards to lots of other things within the prison, particularly looking at vocational training, support with rehabilitation with regards to drugs, helping them for interviews, helping them with housing, helping them with their mental health, and a lot of their narratives were littered with discussions about how much support they had for their mental health and how valuable that was. So there's a lot of support for these dads, and they were widely talking about the support, but they equally were widely talking about actually they felt that they didn't necessarily get much support in their role as fathering. And there was an actual sort of blind spot around this where they felt that they could have valued more support and more opportunity in their role as fathers to help them develop their skills, to help them prepare for outside, to help them manage their feelings and emotions around not being with their children whilst they were incarcerated. One way some of the dads sort of felt they would sort of manage that whilst they were in prison and when they came out of prison actually was really leaning into peer support. Now this tended to be very informal, and in practically every example it was an informal system where dads kind of found their sort of people through talking to other people within the prison, finding other dads and gravitating towards each other. And many of the dads talked about how valuable they found that time in which they could talk about what they'd learned during their experiences, how much they missed their kids, what they were going to do afterwards to make sure that they never were in this situation again and they weren't separated from their children again. And that came up as a real common theme with the dads saying how valuable they found peer support within the prison, but also when they came out of prison, talking to other dads and looking for support from other dads, and found that really useful. So the last part of the interviews that we did with the fathers looked at kind of what's it's been like since. So what's their experience been like since? And the two sort of main areas that came up was around sort of stigma with the children and the children's sort of emotional emotional reintegration with the children, and also the economic reality. And this really kind of really stuck with me. It really upset me, and I don't mind saying that, really, hearing the challenges of the dads when they came out. And one thing particularly they were sort of talking about quite universally, I think, was this real feeling that whilst they were in prison, they didn't want to go back to prison. They wanted to go back to their families, but they also wanted to be more actively involved. So having that break away from the children really made them think, actually, I don't want to miss any school runs. I don't want to miss any plays. I want to be a really active parent. My family are really important to me. So the experience really polarized them with that view, and they really felt strongly that's what they wanted to do when they came out. The challenge for them was when they came out of prison, it was really difficult for them to get flexible work. It was really difficult for them to work in a way that enabled them to be able to have this actively involvement in caregiving that they'd had before, that they really had missed while they were in prison, and they were able to really sort of, they wanted to prioritize picking up their kids over everything. However, the reality was that for many that wasn't possible. They tried to get flexible work. They tried to get something that would enable them to be around for their kids more. And for some, that just wasn't something that was available to them, and therefore they had to go to jobs in which they worked nights, in which they worked away, to enable them to be able to provide for their family, because they weren't able to have a job that gave them that flexibility. And that really sort of, the dads were very sad when they were talking about that. That wasn't a choice they made lightly. It wasn't something that they wanted to do, but they did ultimately think that's what I'm going to have to do, or the only other option for me is to reoffend and take my chances, which just really struck me as such an important thing for us to address, because when you hear these dads, they're really wanting to be actively involved, they're wanting to be decent, they're wanting to look up, they're wanting to also provide for their family, and the flexibility is the key to that, which we all know if you don't have any flexibility, it makes it very difficult to be a very present parent. The other thing that kind of came out in this sort of section of our discussions with the dads was around the sort of complex reality of this emotional reintegration, that actually it wasn't as straightforward as many of the fathers had hoped. During the time that they were separated from their children, they talked to their peers about how much they were looking forward to it and how but it was going to be great when they'd be reunited to with their family. And the little sort of picture there, that's not a very good screenshot, I'm sorry, but that's from a card that was sent to a dad when he was in prison, talking about how much he missed his dad and how happy he was going to be when they were reunited. So a lot of the fathers, when they came out of prison, were expecting this reunion in which it would be very positive and which they'd all kind of live happily ever after. And perhaps not unsurprisingly, women have gone through some of the things that I've explained today. That wasn't the reaction for everybody. Whilst for some it was less traumatic, for others there was a lot of backlash on the children. The children were confused, they were angry, they felt really cross that their dad had had limited contact or hadn't been around. They felt confused when they felt unable to trust them because they were concerned that they would disappear again and therefore were quite distant. And also the dads felt that in many ways they had to work really hard to build that trust again. And one particular sort of the narrative that sticks in my mind was one of sort of dads sort of saying that he used to pick kids up from school, but he felt that there was so much kind of stigma around that his kids didn't want him to pick up from school. So despite kind of dreaming of being there and being able to pick his kids up, his kids were like, I just don't want other people looking at you because you've been in prison. So he said, I used to go and I used to sort of park further away, and then the kids would kind of come up to me, and he said slowly I'd get closer and closer to the school, and eventually I was able to actually pick them up from school and walk with them. But it took time and it took a lot of effort on behalf of the dads and the children, but that wasn't something that they almost expected and they felt prepared for. So some recommendations that have come out of this, and as I sort of mentioned, it would be great to have your views on this and to share your experiences. But some of the recommendations that came out for prisons in particular, that they sort of put into sort of four main areas. Communication was quite key in looking for opportunities to subsidise calls and remove some of the financial barriers around communication. Peer support to actively facilitate father-specific spaces within the prison to enable them to be able to have more sort of dialogue and share their experiences with other dads. Particularly looking at sort of adopting almost sort of if you're in an organisation, you'll often see there's sort of dads groups and parenting groups. So working in that sort of model, but applying that model to a prison setting to be able for dads to have a bit more support and help them prepare for when they're going to come out of prison. To review visits, particularly looking at how you can minimise trauma and looking at potentially video alternatives for very young individuals. And also looking at sort of prioritising and formalising initiatives such as Storybook Dads and parenting workshops, and make that across the PISTA, make it a little bit more clearer that everybody has sort of the standard support. And one thing that was really noticeable that I haven't sort of had a slide on, but was some dads were saying they would have great support. Some dads did say they felt really heard as a parent and they really felt that they had some good support. The challenge was when they were moved from one prison to another, it wasn't consistent. So for example, with Storybook Dads, they might have had a brilliant experience with Storybook Dads and their children would be really used to it and they were really enjoying it and they felt that it was a good way to communicate, but then they might move to a different prison and they didn't have the same access and therefore then they felt that the system sort of fell down. So one of the recommendations that we thought would be helpful is to formalise these parenting supports so that no matter what prison you're in, you'd be getting them all support. So kind of aligned to that is some recommendations for government, particularly looking at policy shifts to break these sort of cycles in which you can see how some dads will go back to reoffending because they can't find a place and they can't make it work since they come out of prison. And particularly looking at mandating affordability and communication policies and community funding to support peer networks whilst in prison, but also continuing that outside of prison. With regard to employment, looking to incentivise employers to offer more flexible work for this population to enable them to be able to manage work and caregiving, and actually explicitly recognise father as a distinct category in rehabilitation strategy. So acknowledging the importance of their roles as fathers and really sort of leaning into that. So kind of next steps really, and the things that I'm kind of working on personally on this project really has inspired me. I've really found it absolutely eye-opening, and it's shown me a whole new way of looking at fatherhood that I hadn't seen before, and it's really been quite impactful. So kind of looking at next steps for me personally, I want to kind of look at international comparisons and compare internationally what do other countries do with regards to fathers, and is it sort of better, is it worse, and what can we learn from each other. Looking at funding opportunities, particularly looking at sort of dads networks and peer support, and looking at how we might be able to build some systems in that sort of way. And also looking at sort of prison leaving fathers and employment and how we can support that population. Just a sort of final word, really. So almost 10 years from the Farmer Review, and it still seems that we've got quite a long way to go. I think there's lots of people who are really keen to do things in this space, lots of people who are doing loads already, but there does seem to be there's a bit more need for us to be a little bit work together a little bit more on this to really try and move the dial a little bit. And it would be great to hear your views and to hear your experiences.